it's so nice that we get to dive into the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is a coaching session for all of us, actually, and really how to live our life and how to live in this world. And we'll talk about this topic today that I'm excited to also speak on. So let me just pull up the verse, and go through the verse, and then we'll go into a little presentation. Can everyone see my screen? Sounds like yes. Okay. So we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam 10:3-19, 10th canto, 3rd chapter, 19th verse. And this is the birth of Lord Krishna. This chapter, Krishna is born to Vasudeva and Devaki. And in this section, Vasudeva, upon seeing Krishna's wonderful form take birth, transcendental form, which doesn't have a beginning or an end, he is reciting these prayers to Krishna. And he goes on, and these are a string of verses where he's repeating these different prayers and glorifying Krishna. So let's read the translation for this verse, the 19th verse of this third chapter. O my Lord, learned Vedic scholars conclude that the creation, maintenance, and annihilation of the entire cosmic manifestation are performed by you, who are free from endeavor, unaffected by the modes of material nature, and changeless in your spiritual situation. There are no contradictions in you, who are the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Parabrahman. Because the three modes of material nature, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, are under your control, everything automatically takes place. We'll read that one more time. Translation. O my Lord, learned Vedic scholars conclude that the creation, maintenance, and annihilation of the entire cosmic manifestation are performed by you, who are free from endeavor, unaffected by the modes of material nature, and changeless in your spiritual situation. There are no contradictions in you, who are the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Parabrahman. Because the three modes of material nature, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, are under your control, everything takes place automatically. Okay, so now, purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So as stated in the Vedas, I'll just go to the translation just for an essence of time. The Supreme Lord has nothing to do, or no one is found to be equal to or greater than him. For everything is done naturally and systematically by his multifarious energies. Creation, maintenance, and annihilation, all conducted personally by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is conferred in the Bhagavad Gita. Maya dakshina prakriti suyate sacharacharam. Yet ultimately, the Lord does not need to do anything, and therefore, he is nirvikara, or changeless. Because everything is done under his direction, he is called Shrishti Karta, the master of creation. Similarly, he is the master of annihilation. When a master sits in one place, while servants work in different duties, whatever the servants are doing is ultimately an activity of the master, although is doing nothing. The Lord's potencies are so numerous that everything is done nicely. Therefore, he is naturally still and is not directly the doer of anything in this material world. Okay, just say some invocation prayers. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Agyantamirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamiti Namine. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Vacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpa Tarubhyasya Kripa Sindhubhyev cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnav Ebhyo Namaha. So just looking at the translation one last time. O my Lord, learned Vedic scholars conclude that the creation, maintenance, and annihilation of the entire cosmic manifestation performed by you, who are free from endeavor, unaffected by the modes of material nature, and changeless in your spiritual situation. There are no contradictions in you, who are the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bara Brahman. Because the three modes of material nature, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, are under your control, everything automatically takes place. Okay. So nice to be with everyone here today. And I wanted to approach this verse in a number of ways, because there's a couple points being made here. And one of them is on the three gunas. And I wanted to take some time to speak about those, and something that we speak about very often in our Vaishnava spiritual community, our sanghas. But sometimes I want to take it a little bit deeper if we can, and see if there's any new learnings that we can take from that. Speaking about these three modes and how they affect us, how they interplay, and they affect us, and how we can rise above them, be more conscious of them. Because sometimes I feel like it's not something that we always are so conscious of on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't. And then also speaking of the other point that's being made here is how Krishna is actually beyond these three modes. He's not actually affected by them. He's situated outside of these three modes. And we'll talk about that as well, and how we can connect to Krishna in a spirit of devotional service. So those are some points, and we'll take this a little deeper. And some of the what we'll talk about has been talked about, and maybe things that you're familiar with. And we'll take that, and hopefully again we can take that a little deeper, see how we can make it relevant to our life, and maybe see it from a different angle, or from new angles, or some new nuances with these topics. So the gunas are so important, I think, to understand as aspiring spiritualists, and really when we study this Shastra and this Vedic scripture, because they affect so much of what we engage with in this world. Actually, in the Gita, it's said that this world is nothing but an interplay of these three modes of material nature. We have Sattva, or the mode of goodness. We have Rajas, the mode of passion, and then Tamas, the mode of darkness or ignorance. So we have these three that are there, and it's explained that these modes are like the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, from my understanding. Those three, and those mix, those are the source, and those mix together, and they produce other combinations, basically. And so in this world, nothing is purely sattva, nothing is necessarily purely rajas or tamas. It's a shade, it's shading, and that's important to note. And so there's a spectrum, a little bit of a spectrum of these three that we see when we operate in this world. And I made a little graphic to kind of just break this down for us, so everyone can follow along. I like making graphics. So it's a nice, easy way to understand. So we have our modes, and we have the mode of goodness, sattva, passion, rajas, and ignorance, tamas. Now, let's look at some qualities of these modes and how they affect us. Because in this verse, Vasudeva is glorifying Krishna as that you are beyond these three modes. But the rest of the world is being affected by this, which is including us. So we look at, when it comes to sattva, some of the qualities: peace, clarity, equanimity, purity, vitality, meaningful connection. This is the mode of goodness. We have rajas. Rajas is all about hankering, about striving, about chasing, a sense of attachment, a desire for success, envy, hankering, intense endeavor. And also there's confusion, there's reactiveness. When we're in a place of rajas, we're reacting to the world around us, not responding, generally speaking. We're reacting. Rajas is also the energy of creation, though. So creativity comes from this. So this is represented and we'll talk about how this is represented. But this is also the energy of creativity. And then we have the mode of ignorance, which is We have anger, fearfulness, lamentation, illusion, egotism, laziness. We need to really avoid these. And tamas also has its place, but tamas is that energy of darkness. That is the energy of renewal, actually, but it's the energy of darkness. And we can look at many different things in this world and see these three gunas playing out. And I was just thinking about this, and I would love to even hear some examples. So we have Sat, which is the mode of goodness, so it brings wisdom, clarity. Rajas, which is the mode of passion, so creativity, desire. And then we have Tamas, which is the mode of darkness, which generally brings more destruction and renewal and other things of that nature. If we look at, for example, even some examples, and go ahead and write into the chat if you think of any examples, we can get some brainstorming here. But even if we think about this world and we look at, let's say, a movie, or like a television show that we're watching. So in Sattva, maybe we're thinking of something, or let's say a movie in this case, that's uplifting, that's hope-giving, that's inspiring. Maybe it's a spiritual film, documentary, etc. In Rajas, we're thinking more of, just to get some examples to make this concrete, maybe an action movie, a thriller, right? That's one of those thrillers where it's Rajas, and maybe also like a romantic movie where there's a lot of that. That's Rajas. And then we have Tamas, which is some of the movies that we also see or films that we see in our world, where it could be maybe a scary film or very dark or twisted, etc. sort of situation. So that's in the sphere of, let's just say, cinema or film or what we're seeing, but that has a profound effect when we are engaging with a certain energy. It affects our consciousness. It leaves some scars, impressions in our mind, and those impressions accumulate, and they become our beliefs, they become our habits, they become our thoughts, and that's how we start to play with those gunas and how they start to affect us. Gunas actually means ropes because they bind us. Through these impressions, they become habits that we start to engage with. Then that affects us. Yes, this is awesome. So I'm looking at the chat here. Bhakta Hugo says, mode of Rajas, we are reacting to the world and responding to the world. Thank you. Yes, that is really important. And Andrea, you said types of books we read. This is absolutely true. We could look at books as well. Food, if it's a himsa or trying to be sattvic. So yes, that was another example I was thinking of, food. So Krishna says in the Gita, he breaks out different types of food. And for sattva, he says food that is nourishing to the body and brings longevity and is fresh, etc. So maybe in that case, let's look at maybe some food. So for example, it might be in sattva, we're looking at maybe some fresh pressed juice, veggie juice. Maybe for Rajas, we're looking at, we have coffee or caffeine. We see this in the city. So many people love to drink coffee. It's always on the go. And then tamas, maybe something that's more putrid or stale or rotten, or maybe even drugs or alcohol can fall in that category of tamas. Let's look at what else we have in the chat. Conversations. I love that, Jimajai. I'm just going to speak about that in a second. Music, absolutely. There was actually a study done by, I heard this in a lecture, I think it was by His Grace Ayendra Prabhu, but there was a study done by Amar Bose, who's the founder, he passed away some years back, but he was the founder of Bose, which is the audio system. They make speakers and entertainment systems for cars, a very famous company for those of you who are familiar. And he did a study, I think that I heard that he studied the effect of music, different types of music, on cows and how much milk they produce. So he played heavy metal music, which would fall more in the tamasic area, and then he played, I think, some more modern music, etc. And then he played some classical flute as more sattvic music, and he studied how much milk cows would produce. And I believe in this, he actually found that when there was more sattvic music playing, which in this case I think it was the classical bansuri flute music, cows produced more milk. Actually, it had a tangible effect on their mind and on their body. Actually, so music is absolutely a way we can see these three modes taking effect. Jamuna Jaya Prabhu mentioned conversations. And this is one I want to actually bring up as well. This is a more subtle point when we're thinking of music, when we're thinking of food or entertainment or movie or whatever. That is a little bit more gross, but it can get even more subtle. When we think of conversations, there's a really nice breakdown by Sri Madhavacharya. He talks about how there's three types of conversations. There's three types of conversations. And the first is Vada, which is the mode of goodness. It's called Vada. And the goal in the mode of goodness in Vada is when you're having a discussion with another individual, is to come to a deeper understanding of the truth. To come to a deeper understanding of the truth. It's a very important point. And the goal is to do that and to also create mutual understanding, to learn from each other, to grow, to learn. Then the next stage in the mode of Rajas is called Jalpa. Jalpa. And the motive in Rajas, in a conversation, is to impress or to establish your own position or to be right. How many times have we engaged in this ourselves, or have we seen this in conversation? We're trying to speak to someone, we have maybe something to share, our heart or some point, and all we're getting back is what they're feeling or what they're experiencing and how they're right potentially, or how we think we're right. And that's very much the mode of Rajas. Where in the mode of Rajas, we're focusing on ourselves and we're focusing on establishing our own position, practically speaking. So we always make it about us. So if we're having a conversation, someone might be sharing a feeling or something. We've all done this where we make it about us. We respond from our perspective instead of suspending our need to be in the center for a second and actually hearing and seeing this person fully. That would be the mode of goodness. We jump in with our own perspective. Now, what's interesting here is that one might say, well, okay, what's wrong with that? What's the effect of that type of conversation? Well, a conversation done in the mode of passion, it actually affects our ability to connect with other people. We don't actually create a real connection, heart-to-heart connection. We create an ego-to-ego connection, or just having a superficial conversation. And we see this a lot. I lived in New York for many years, and we're not too far. I grew up in this area, and I was born in New York actually, and now live in New Jersey. But often you see this, in New York, such a beautiful place, but there's so much going on that sometimes it's easy to get lost in that and not to actually engage in meaningful conversation with other people. Sometimes you can just see someone and you're seeing them and it's like, hey, good to see you for 10 seconds. And we don't take that time to go deeper. And then the last type of conversation is called Vitanda. And I can put this into the chat maybe at the end if you want the actual words. And that's the motive of ignorance, tamas, conversation in the mode of ignorance. And the motive in that case is to actually undermine someone. Is to undermine an argument and to shut someone down without any constructive intent. So this will come across as we're belittling others, we're blaming, we're quibbling, we're arguing with no constructive intent. And we've all definitely either partaken or seen these conversations as well. So think about how these three can affect us in terms of connecting with others, and how can we create more space to have discussion in the mode of goodness, Vada, where we're actually focusing on arriving at the deeper understanding of the truth. Right? Thinking about conversations you might have with family, with friends around the table, or in our communities. We have different perspectives, and we are very enthusiastic or feeling very charged about our perspective and righteous about our perspective, or that we're having with our colleagues, etc. Can we come to it from a perspective of sattva, of learning? What can I learn from this? How can I understand and also maybe share a few things as well? Or is it all about our position, establishing that we're right and others are wrong? Because if we're right, others are wrong. And then, or tamas, where we're actually just destroying the other position without any constructive goal. Let's think about that and let's reflect on that, because we can apply that into our life. And even if we just apply this in one area, how we connect to others in conversation, it can make a profound difference in our communities, in our spiritual life, in the world, actually. Question here: would sarcasm be in the mode of tamas? I would say yes. It depends on the intention. So sometimes it depends on the intention, meaning that if it's done from that perspective of actually belittling others, then yes, that would be tamas. Sometimes in relationships we do it in a lighthearted way, where there's actually a heart-to-heart relationship. We might engage in that. That's okay, as long as it's established in the relationship. And there's a sambandha between the relationship between the two individuals. But if it's done with that mode, we kind of know when we're doing it in a lighthearted way, or if there's something darker or heavier behind that. And so that would be how I would say it's more of the intention of what's going on, the energy behind it. Bhakti Center thinks Anand Vihar Prabhu says, "What if I'm actually right when others are wrong?" Well, we all feel that way, and that's the problem with Rajas. When we're having a conversation in that way, everyone feels like their position is the right position. And what's interesting is that when we say having conversations in the mode of goodness, it doesn't mean that we can't feel like we have a proper perspective, or that we might have something to offer or be right. The problem is that when we think that that's the only way, we're not open to learning, to growing, to more understanding, right? And so the desire to be right in itself is a mode of tamas and rajas. That's correct. It's when we think that we have to be right, and that we're not open to other people's perspective and learning in that way. Okay, so those are some examples. We talked about the modes, just sort of how they're a color spectrum, if you will. Everything here is a mix. We talked about some of the qualities of all three, and then some examples. Brought in looking at things such as cinema or entertainment, which is all around us. We looked at food and how we can see the qualities. And then also we looked at something more subtle, conversations, how that affects our connection with each other. And the last point I'll just make on sattvic communication is that it's communication done to create mutual understanding and to arrive at a deeper aspect of the truth. But it's also done, this is really nice, and I was reading this in a book by a wonderful devotee. He said that it's also done without any personal agenda. When you come into a conversation without any personal agenda, and we come into a conversation without judgment, suspending our judgment, and coming into actually being open to learn. Again, going back to being right, often that comes from a place of judgment, thinking that we have to be right, or we have to be the superior one, and not being open or being vulnerable to being potentially wrong or being educated on a topic further. Very important. Okay, so let's go back into this slide. And one point I wanted to make on Rajas also is that, from my observation, I think that it's the most popular energy in the world, actually, from a default perspective. Sort of the default perspective that we see in so many places, even tamas. Actually, it's interesting when I look around, and even when you flick on the TV or something of that nature, you see nowadays I see so many shows that are very rajasic or tamasic, actually. And there's a lot of documentaries on different things, on murders and this situation and that situation. And if we're actually, when we're engaging in those, we're actually engaging that rajasic and tamasic energy, because we're engaging in that way and with that energy, and it's affecting our mindset. So when we look at the three modes, let's also look at, I wanted to talk briefly on the qualities, but then also the effort. The mode of and the themes about them. So the mode of goodness, as we talked about, is pacifying. It's pacifying. The mode of passion is agitating, and tamas is devastating. It's destructive. Effort type, when we look at these efforts, it's interesting, and I want to make this point, that the mode of goodness is actually all about maintenance. And this is why it's represented by Lord Vishnu. all about maintenance. Passion is all about creation, which is easy. And ignorance is all about destruction, which is even easier. We have preservation or maintenance, creation, and destruction. And the point here is that sattva is hard to engage with. It takes effort to engage in sattva guna. The example can be given of going to the gym. To go to get a gym membership, or to even do, let's say, our sadhana, to start or make a commitment is very easy. I'm going to do this, or I'm going to go to the gym for X amount of days. But to actually do it, to maintain that, and it is difficult, actually, because we have to work through showing up on a daily basis. Similarly, destroying something is very easy as well. Canceling that gym membership or saying I quit is also very easy. It's actually the easiest. And so sattva is actually hard to implement in our daily life as well. And that's something that we need to note, that we need to make conscious space and time for, because it's a more difficult energy to engage with. It's easy to create something. It's easy to, again, create a relationship. It's easy to destroy a relationship. They say that it takes years to create a reputation and 1 moment to lose one. So this is a practical example. But to actually maintain a relationship with someone, for those of you who have friends for many years, or a partner, whatever the case might be, colleagues, spiritual community, it takes effort to create a meaningful relationship, a lot of effort, actually. And this is the sattva guna. It's about getting conscious. It's about building a healthy foundation. Again, maintenance is the hardest. And going back to our chart here, it's represented by these deities. So we have Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiva. This is talked about in the next verse, actually, how they are ruling these different aspects. And ultimately, it's managed by Krishna, as mentioned in this verse. And then let's look at some of the results very briefly. Very briefly here. The results of the mode of goodness are wisdom, self-happiness, or happiness that comes from the self, Atmarati, clarity, insight, illumination, stability, healing, understanding, life-enhancing properties. And interestingly enough, it says that, in the Gita, it says that the mode of goodness is like poison in the beginning, but nectar at the end, which awakens one to self-realization. It's difficult in the beginning, but it's nectar at the end. We just talked about that when it comes to, let's say, a relationship. Can be difficult. Again, that maintenance, that work, but it's very important. Similarly with our sadhana, it's difficult sometimes. We don't feel like doing it, but the results come when we actually show up over time. With passion, it's interesting, it's the other way around. So the results are mixed. Greed, actually passion brings more greed, and eventually feeling burnt out with all that running around, all that hankering. And it is very seductive at first. Feels like nectar at first, but poison at the end. Actually is not so good. That is said to be in the nature of passion. And ignorance is poison at the beginning and at the end as well. On both areas, it's there. So I wanted to just pause here and just for a second. So we talked about the 3 modes, how the qualities, the themes, the deities that are ruling them, and how it affects our interactions with each other, with ourselves, and how we're engaging with it daily in the world. I wanted to also share this example, and I heard this example from a senior devotee, and I really liked it, around the 3 gunas and how we can see the interplay. And I took it and kind of adapted it a little bit on my own. But if we think about this example of Arjuna, this is Arjuna, our spiritual warrior. We're all spiritual warriors. And if we think about an example of hitting a target with a bow and arrow. So let's say that our body is the archer, and then we have this target, which is the arrow. And that is our spirit soul. And our goal is Krishna, right? Krishna consciousness. That's our goal. So if the arrow is our spirit soul, then the bow is bhakti. It's the method of how we get to Krishna, right? We're shooting this target there. Now, we're thinking, okay, well, we have everything that we need here. How do the gunas play in here? We have our bow, we have our bow, we have our arrow, we have our archer. The gunas are the foundation, actually the ground that we're standing on. So if our spiritual is the arrow, the bow is bhakti, and we're trying to reach Krishna, the ground is the gunas. What type of ground are we standing on? And I love this example because it puts into perspective that it's not necessarily directly always relevant to Krishna consciousness, but it is extremely relevant to Krishna consciousness in its own way and very important. For example, sattva. So let's look at another example here. Sattva would be firm and even earth, having some firm and even earth underneath you. Then rajas would be sort of like the example that came to my mind as I was thinking about this was frozen ice. Frozen ice. It's like shooting an arrow on frozen ice, engaging in rajas. Why frozen ice? Has anyone been on a frozen lake at all, ever? Andrea, awesome. Yeah, so I was just thinking of, my wife and I actually lived near Prospect Park in New York when we were living there, and in the winter, it gets very chilly and the lake freezes over. There's a huge lake there. It's a beautiful lake. And we were walking there, and I decided to go on the lake. And I just one step in, not too far in, just one step in. And when I first went in, it was great. It was exhilarating. It was wonderful. And I was saying, wow, this is amazing. And I was mindful, obviously. But then I went in at another point, just taking one step in, at another point of the lake, and I started to hear the ice cracking underneath me. So I jumped back to the earth. And this is like engaging in the mode of passion. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's exhilarating. When it's good, it's really good. And it feels good, although it's not really actually nourishing the heart. But when it's bad, it can also be quite bad, right? So it's like being on frozen ice. And it's interesting, when I was walking there with my wife, who's on here as well, Mbika, we were seeing that there was ladders actually there were these wooden ladders around the park. And I was inquiring about why these ladders were there around the lake. And they were mentioning that people in the winter, they often go quite far. And I was just taking one step. Many people take 15, 20, 30 steps into the lake. And then sometimes the ice cracks. And then they get stuck underwater, so unfortunately. And they have to have these ladders where they throw these ladders in to the lake to pull people out, actually, to save people's lives. And so this happens. This is like playing with that energy of the mode of passion. So we have that frozen ice. Then we're looking at tamas, which is the example that came to my mind. If we were shooting this arrow, the archer trying to reach Krishna, it's like quicksand. It's like quicksand. Quicksand looks appealing potentially, and we might think it's normal or it's something that is just there, but we think we're going to use it, but it actually ends up using us. We get pulled in. We immediately get pulled in, and we get stuck, basically. So engaging in the mode of darkness it's like being in a swamp. We end up getting stuck ourselves, and it's not useful in any which way. So those are some examples when it comes to these three gunas, when it comes to this example of shooting an arrow, reaching Krishna. So it's really important that we're thinking of how do we create firm earth underneath us. Is our mindset, is our lifestyle, is our spiritual practice, are we engaging in rajas and the mode of passion? Are we really living in that way? Sometimes I feel like we are. And sometimes I look at my life and I can see, okay, I need to make some adjustments. There's tamas, we need to be mindful of that as well. How can we create that firm earth underneath us? It's very important. And what is that firm earth? It's really, sattva can be practiced by the things that we engage in, so our spiritual practice. But then there's also the values underneath sattva guna. There's values that we can engage with. Sattva really requires us to slow down. Again, it's hard work. We need to slow down. And we'll talk a little bit about beyond sattva, because sattva is a good landing spot for us, mode of goodness, cultivating that as devotees and as spiritualists, but it's not the end all be all. But it really requires us to slow down, to be. And this is actually one of the things I notice in our devotee community. Sometimes we're thinking that we're in practicing bhakti, or we're trying to go beyond the three modes to Shuddha Sattva. We're not engaging with Sattva enough, and we're maybe more in the Rajas area sometimes. We can see this from our conversations sometimes. If we're focusing again, getting lost in superficial connection, not focusing on others and being able to create meaningful connection, then we're probably engaging with that energy a lot. And I think it's affecting our relationships, our spiritual communities, etc. So I think that this is something I notice, that sometimes we don't engage enough in this energy. We're not conscious enough. We might think we're practicing, we have our spiritual practice, but we can get stuck in these lower modes, which is natural. Let's normalize this too. In this world, it's easy to get pulled down. Again, Rajas is such a predominant energy. I know when I used to work in New York a lot, it's so easy to get sucked in to that energy, especially in these cities, and especially in high Rajas areas where there's a lot of that energy. Versus if you're in a countryside, whatnot, it's a little bit easier to engage in sattva because there's so much nature around you, there's so much of that energy of vitality, of being. So when we think about creating a mindset that's based off sattva, how do we do this? What's our opportunity? And I wanted to take us home here, and then I'll open it up for comments, questions, thoughts as well. We have an opportunity, and we have the power of choice as a human being. That's one of the beautiful things that we have as humans in this human form of life. And it's stated also in our Shastras so many times that because we're given this human form, we have an opportunity to actually make a choice. When we look at the lower forms of life, when it comes to animals and etc., they operate generally on an instinctual basis. But as humans, we have an opportunity to think about how we like to engage, in this world, and use that to actually ask the deeper questions and to grow spiritually. We have this opportunity. And our choices are really important because, like I mentioned already, what we engage with when it comes to these gunas is what we become. So generally we act in a certain guna, it yields a result of that guna or even less. So we're acting in the mode of passion, it's going to give us a result in the mode of passion, which is mixed. Like we talked about that frozen ice. It can be slippery, it can be dangerous. We don't know where it's going to go. It can be exhilarating sometimes, but it can be a very much a mixed bag that usually doesn't end up so positive. So we can see this, that in this world, there's many things we can't control, whether it's the news, the stock market, world events, etc., other people's perceptions or attitudes or what they do, but we can control our choice in terms of what we engage with, what we're inputting into ourselves, and inputting as much as we can that's positive. Sometimes it's hard to avoid the other things, but as much as we can that's positive, uplifting, that's spiritual for us, based off what we hear, what we see, what we taste, the five senses. We can look at all of that. And actually, this is also the point of Vaidhi Bhakti, or Bhakti and following the rules, even when it comes to this path of Bhakti Yoga, is to actually bring us to this platform of Sattva. It's actually to bring us here. And it's not the goal, but it's bringing us to a platform where we have that firm foundation, that even earth underneath our surface. So when we're practicing Bhakti, when we're trying to shoot that arrow to reach Krishna, we have a firm foundation to actually be standing on. This is the goal, actually, of Vaidhi Bhakti, from my understanding. And also we have in the yoga tradition the namas and niyamas, the things to do and not to do. It's very similar. It's how do we have habits and values that are sustaining this. And then we can, I'm just looking at my notes here, and then we can move from, when we start to engage with sattva, we can also move beyond sattva. When we start to engage more in sattva, there's another mode, which is actually not a mode, it's another platform, it's a transcendental platform called Shuddha Sattva. And this is where we start to move beyond goodness, because interestingly, the mode of goodness also attaches us. It's said in the Gita where it attaches us to happiness and to knowledge, to wisdom. And it's also a guna, and it's helpful on the path to bhakti, but it's also not the end-all be-all. But we need to engage with it, because otherwise we don't have that firm foundation. And Krishna says in the Gita, in the 14th chapter, 26th verse, he describes one who can transcend the modes. So we talked about the three. How do we transcend them? And he talks about how through devotional service we can transcend the modes of nature. Because true bhakti is not really oriented on the modes. That's in this world, but it's beyond the modes. We see the gopis of Vrindavan, they're not necessarily, they're not affected by the rules and regulations of what needs to happen. But because they're such advanced spiritualists and yogis, the gopis, they're in perfect alignment with Krishna at all times, and the Leela that's going on in his pastimes. And so Shuddha Sattva is a platform where there isn't any contamination of the three modes. We're not affected by the three modes of nature, because we're fully realized in our relationship with Krishna and the world. We've really cultivated that heart space. We've really cultivated that bhava, that ruchi, so much so. And this needs to be practiced. I want to make this point as I wrap up, that sometimes we need to really practice. Sometimes we have a understanding of Krishna consciousness that might not be complete, I feel, because we use the word, it's important to be Krishna conscious. And I want to redefine that a little bit today, or maybe bring a thought into it, potentially from my perspective. Because what is real Krishna consciousness? Right? What's this platform of bhakti or Shuddha Sattva? What is real Krishna consciousness? Sometimes we think it's about chanting our rounds, which is absolutely true. It's about doing our services. It's definitely true as well. But it's a little bit more than that. It's also the mindset. It's the state of consciousness behind what we're doing, not just what we're doing. Srila Prabhupada used to say, always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. That's also such an important, again, mindset piece of it. As I was thinking about it, what was coming up for me, and I wanted to offer this as we are wrapping up this session. For me, I was really thinking of Mahaprabhu's Shikshashtakam and the verses that he gives, because he really talks about, he doesn't talk so much about what you need to do, but he talks about how you need to do it in so many of the verses. What's the mindset behind the practitioner of bhakti, and what we want to practice cultivating. We don't say that we have achieved Krishna consciousness. We don't say that we have achieved perfection. We say we're practicing. We're practicing this. Practice means that we're working on it on a daily basis. Every day we're working on being, even if we're 0.5% better, every day, we're still working on it, and over months and years and etc., we'll continue to grow. And I was thinking that real Krishna consciousness, it was really coming to my heart, that it's all about seeing others and ourselves the way Krishna sees us and others. The way Krishna sees us and how he sees other people. Sometimes we can get so lost in, especially when we're in these lower modes of sattva, of rajas and tamas, we get lost in these small stories. These small stories of what we think we are and what we think other people are. We tend to be judgmental. Again, we talked about the hankering, the attachment, the greed. As we move up towards sattva, we start to have more illumination. There's more illumination, there's more wisdom, there's more clarity. It's more seeing things as they are, not as we want them to be. And that's what sattva guna gives us. When we engage with that, we start to see the world from a more philosophical, from a more spiritual perspective, naturally speaking. Now, when we move that up toward Shuddha Sattva, or the transcendental situation, or bhakti, when we're practicing bhakti and we're starting to move to more serious stages, our mindset also, our consciousness shifts even deeper, where we're not getting lost in some of those smaller stories, and we're not even just thinking of others, okay, we're seeing some illumination, some clarity, but we're actually seeing others how Krishna sees them, which is with unconditional love, with empathy, with compassion, with love and humility. We start to see others and ourselves in that way. And this is how we can see if we're actually progressing on the path of Bhakti Yoga. Are we seeing others in that way? Are we starting to make progress in that way? Are we starting to engage in devotional service in that way? And again, this is it's a practice. We don't always get it right. We might not get it right many times, actually, and we might fall many times. But are we gradually getting better at this? This is the mindset Mahaprabhu mentions in the Shikshashtakam, Trinadapi Sunichena. And in that verse, he talks about the mindset, being humble and being tolerant is so important. So these qualities, I think that building our bhakti on qualities such as empathy, compassion, vulnerability, humility, that's even more important because that sustains our bhakti, and it lets us sustain our devotional service where we're actually growing in a positive way. And Krishna actually talks about this in the Gita as well. He says in the 5th chapter, 18th verse, a very well-known verse. He says that a humble sage, by the virtue of true knowledge, someone who's actually in knowledge, again, sattva gives illumination, but going beyond that, he sees with equal vision, pandita samadarshana. He sees all beings as spirit souls, as parts of Krishna, and sees them with equal vision. So we treat people with respect, with kindness, and we try our best to strive in this mindset of building these qualities, actually. And I think that's really Krishna consciousness. If we're, and I'll be a little heavy here and say this, that if we're doing everything else and we're not doing that, then we're missing something really important. And I would go as far as venturing to say that what we're doing is not fully Krishna conscious. We need to work on that aspect to support that, to support our sadhana, to support our service. Obviously, that will purify us as well. Our service and sadhana will purify us. At the same time, if we're cultivating these things, the mindset that Mahaprabhu and Krishna are talking about, the Gita and the Shikshashtakam, respectively, then we're supporting our practice and we're moving from sattva eventually to bhakti and to the higher stages of bhakti and Shuddha Sattva as well. So I wanted to share that. I know that was those are some thoughts that were coming to my mind, and that will actually connect us to Krishna. Going back to this verse, it's said that Krishna is beyond the 3 modes, because Krishna is not affected by these energies. Krishna says that in the Gita, he says, I don't envy anyone. I'm not partial to anyone, actually. So Krishna is not affected by these things. But when we can actually take responsibility for our own spiritual life, continue to work on these aspects, engage with more sattva guna, and then start to move beyond sattva as well, slowly, gradually, through the process of bhakti yoga and serving with our heart, then we can truly be God conscious and to be realized. So I wanted to end with that. I'll open it up for any questions, for thoughts, for questions, and etc. Thank you all. Haribo.
So it looks like we had Shishashtaka Prabhu raise his hand first, and then we have Angelika.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. I think what you were saying about being right, even devotees, we think we're right in our conversations and the mode of passion. And it really is an impediment and a place of conflict, where conflict arises when we think we're right and other people, or we value our own opinions more than other people's opinions. And we're not even taking into, like what you're saying about Krishna's opinion, how to see others or even our own opinions in the light of Krishna's opinion. If we think we're right, then how intelligent we think we're more than Krishna? So how puffed up is that? It's actually, you're saying, living in a city and how we are afflicted by the mode of passion, and that so stealthily You know, I think Adi Prush, you know, like Maya's like right behind you, and she's also like halfway around the block, you know, and it creeps up on you. So you might not even realize in your conversation how I am putting forward my own presentation and not considering where Krishna is. And Ralph Waldo Emerson used to say, there's always three people in the conversation. Krishna's always in the background of every single conversation. We always have to recognize and listen to that third person. And, you know, being in the mode of passion, like you say, like in a city or something like that, the mode of passion is demoniac. And I think a lot of devotees, you know, we get caught up in our own way of thinking. We think we're right because we're devotees, but maybe we've been hanging around the internet too long. We're picking up on so many different conspiracy theories and political partisan and a vision, and they're contaminating our consciousness to the point where we think we know something that nobody else knows, and then they go into the deep end of conspiracy theories, and it's very dangerous because it can actually cause offenses to other devotees because we're not considering what other people think, especially what Krishna thinks.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Prabhu. Yes, that's so wonderful.
The Shikshastra, you know, I try, you know, third verse, you know, because that's my name. I try to live up to it, but you know, you're supposed to. Krishnadas Kaviraj says you're supposed to wear that third verse around your neck, which I do.
Wow, thank you.
Can we see it, Shikshashtakam Prabhu? Can we see the verse on your neck?
Yeah, it's right here.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Prabhu, for that insight, Shikshashika Prabhu. That is so it's spot on, and that's what exactly I was getting to when I was sharing that, because sometimes we can have this superiority complex where we need to be right in every conversation, and also sometimes we feel like because we're practicing such a deep philosophy and we have such wonderful points that we are right, and often, and especially in relationship, we can see this where if we prioritize being right over the relationship, actually our ego gets in the way of the relationship so often, and we have to all make this decision where are we going to be right, or are we actually going to learn and be open to other people. And I think this is really an important point, actually. And to your point that you were mentioning around even where we were talking about Krishna seeing others as well, one of the things that came to my mind that I didn't mention that I wanted to was that I was realizing that even if we see others the way Krishna sees them, then it would change our perspective when it comes to so many people. Even people that bother us or are really hard to be around, potentially, we can view them differently because they're still children of Krishna, and Krishna still loves them deeply. And it actually shifts our perspective when we look at it in that way. And even if there's someone who is, I was thinking of, you know, even the worst person in the world that you think of someone who's super negative or demoniac, or someone you've seen that has done so many negative and atrocious things, even that person is worthy of love from Krishna. And we see this even in pastimes in the scriptures where Krishna, even after being attacked or being insulted or someone doing so much different damage, they're still given shelter by Krishna, actually. So we have to take that into consideration when we're actually thinking about viewing others the way Krishna views them. It's not an easy thing, but when we actually think about it, it actually shifts our perspective when it comes to how do we share compassion with anyone, even someone who's very much bothering us, or we feel like they're our worst enemy, or they're the worst person, or whatever, and how can we actually show them some compassion? Anyway, but thank you, Prabhu, for your point. I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's a real point about showing compassion, because, you know, like Putana came to kill Krishna, but she was acting sort of like, I guess, he gave her a position of, I mean, how compassionate is that? And so, it's really a good point how we view others and how Krishna is always compassionate on everyone. Doesn't matter who it is. The most demonic, self-centered, egotistical, egomaniacal person in the world who always thinks they're right. Still, Krishna's in their heart.
Right, exactly. Absolutely. Thank you, Prabhu. Yes. Any other thoughts? I see a couple other hands, by the way, as well. Bhakta Hugo and yes, did you want to jump in there?
Hare Krishna. Good morning. Thank you for the wonderful class. I think the discussion on the gunas and how they come into how we interact with the bhakti and how we interact with the world is so important. And especially for me, I'm in the US Navy. I kind of mentioned this in yesterday's morning session, but in the Navy, it's very much, it's hard to get more rajas than the military. And so I've definitely seen how important it is to really be, in my personal experience, to really be conscious of how the modes are interacting in my own life. You kind of spoke about living in New York and how, when you're living in the city in an urban environment, it's so easy to just not even notice when you're kind of degrading into that mode of rajas, into that activity and passion. In the same way in the military, when everyone is there's that power of assertion and let's do things and there's a mission and there's motivation, these kinds of things. To be aware of that, it should be a humbling experience to kind of be self-aware enough to recognize, like, wow, I'm not invincible. It's very easy for me to slip up and to work on that. So that's a personal reflection from me. I did have a question.
Wonderful.
In that we have, so when we think of kind of a stereotypical yogi, we'll say the yogi who's living in the mountain caves or in the forest or what have you, that's very clearly mode of sattva, right? And ideally they're going above sattva and into the spiritual realm, but if they fall, they're falling onto a foundation of sattva because of the atmosphere they're cultivating. But within bhakti, as we practice it, as was kind of passed down to us by Srila Prabhupada, by Bhakti Siddhanta and our more recent acharyas, we are a preaching mission. We are, the Bhakti Center is such a perfect example. We're taking spiritual wisdom and placing it in the middle of like the most rajasic, tamasic environments in all the cities. We go, there's preachers going to the ghettos and sharing bhakti there, or feeding the homeless and, being in the poorer parts of cities, or all these kinds of things. And we're building so many temples and we have programs, and who knows how many millions of dollars are being spent by ISKCON and acquired by ISKCON every year just managing projects.
Yeah.
And so that kind of seems to be in the mode of passion. And I guess it's a controlled application of the mode of passion. And so that's one question, kind of how does passion interact with that? And then the kind of follow-up question to that, even if we acknowledge that, well, it's a spiritual activity. So although it may look a certain way, it's really on the transcendental platform. But even if that's the case, we can observe that in our community because of the fact that we have managers and organizers and treasurers and all these things. It's an unfortunate fact that because of the fact that there are so many projects, devotees can come into conflict, or no, it should be done this way, not that way, or no, we should go over there, not here. We should buy this, not that. And how, because of the fact that we're so active in how we engage with bhakti, that can easily cause conflict. And so I was curious, kind of posing that as a question, how do we as practitioners of this very engaging and active and outward spiritual path, how do we manage that mode of passion and make sure that we can still stay in a peaceful, focused, wise place in our activities?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you for your thoughts and that question. That's the challenge. And I think that you mentioned even our tradition, it's about sharing and not just being on the mountaintop or in the forest or in the village. And obviously we have many acharyas who did some of that, but Mahaprabhu's mood is to share with others, to be out in the streets and to be out in the world. I think that that's actually the beautiful thing, though, when it comes to our path and also our tradition, because it's actually, I think, harder to practice in the city. It's harder to practice in the Navy, in the world, in day to day. And I think that's where the theory or the being in or reading our Shastra and we're looking at some of that hits the really the rubber of the road of daily life. And so I think that it's really a wonderful place. I think it's actually harder to practice, for example, like renunciation when you're in the world than when you're actually living in the mountaintop, because you're actually being tested daily in that case. And so I think it's actually helps us to, we can view it as a challenge, very much so, of how can we, like you are doing and you mentioned, how do we apply some of these things that we're learning from Shastra, from our classes, from our wisdom, to our daily life practically. And it's going to always be a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of a back and forth. Sometimes we miss, some days we get it, sometimes we miss, and but how are we growing year to year, month to month, etc. And then to your question around rajas and also sharing bhakti and whatnot, that is absolutely true. And that's why I bring this, that's why was one of the inspirations behind this class. That's why I bring this up, because sometimes we can get really lost in just sharing and not cultivating sattva in our life, actually. And sattva guna takes some energy to create. It's a very conscious energy that we have to create. And so this is why it's so important that we're having forums to discuss to discuss our sadhana, to get sangha, to discuss shastra and wisdom. All of this, it's really important that we have that sangha, and that we're cultivating atmospheres where we can be in more sattva guna. That's really, really important, because it's so vital. And otherwise we can get into conflicts. Conflicts are also natural when it comes to in this world. It's a natural thing when there's it's not a bad thing necessarily, but we want to avoid, in rajas it can become a little bit more deadly, because we become self-centered, self-focused, etc. That's to your question. There's no short answer. The point is that we need to engage in our practice with sincerity, and the more we grow in our practice of bhakti, in our practice of growing spiritually, we'll be able to manage some of these things easier, and with more consciousness, more ease, more wisdom, more illumination, and it will be actually easier to manage some of these conflicts, some of these differences. And again, there will be meaningful connection. So when we look at rajas, for example, we might be thinking we're right, for example, in a conversation with someone. That's going to get in the way of actual understanding. If you approach it from sattva, there can be understanding, and there can be so much more energy that's used to move forward in cooperation. So some of these lower modes, we can get stuck in them. We can get stuck in them very much so. So the short answer is really we have to be very mindful of cultivating these mindsets and these energies, especially sattva guna. And also to your point, I will say that rajas also has its place sometimes. It has its place, especially in this world. Sometimes mode of passion is necessary to get certain things done. Even if we look at in the beginning of the movement and whatnot, there's a lot of passion to get certain things done. And it was necessary in a lot of ways and at that time. So there's a time and place for things, but we want to be mindful of not engaging with it for too long, where we can also get a lot done in sattva guna, and it's actually easier to get it done with more ease, and less destruction and chaos around us, basically. Sometimes we prioritize projects over people. We see this, and it's like the project gets done, but everyone's upset, right? Everyone's really, really, relationships are destroyed, health is destroyed, and all these things are destroyed. That's not sattva guna. Sattva guna is a thing gets done, but it gets done in a way where it's life enriching, it's life enhancing, relationships are enhanced, health is enhanced, our spiritual life is enhanced as much as possible. So does that answer your question? Hopefully it does.
It does. Thank you for the reflections. I'm appreciative.
Okay, awesome. And we had a couple more questions as well.
Yeah, Angelica's had her hand up for a while.
Yes. And I see, how did you meet
Krishna?
Is that a question about my wife? That's her name is Ambika. It's Ambika. She's on as well. Okay, yes. Question. Please ask your question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, dear Ambika Prabhu, for supporting your husband. It's so beautiful because actually Hugo Prabhu's reflection was similar to what I wanted to say. But
Yes.
first, I just wanted to reflect that I feel that the focus on your class has been on cultivating the character and spiritual groundedness from which we can act. And so in this way, we can feel that we have the rootedness that we require in order to act in the world and not to be swept away by so many of the modes that are acting upon us. And what came to my mind is simply that spiritual strength is cultivated in no other way but by following the acharyas and thus following the four regulative principles, chanting 16 rounds and really applying ourselves to the process that we are trying to commit ourselves to. And that just brought to my mind a quote I read from Prabhupada's letter. Now just read it, it's only 2 sentences long. I think it is very obvious, and you have admitted, that the problem is you are not following the basic principles for our society. The fact that you have not chanted your rounds for a long time is enough to make you without any spiritual strength. That's from May 26, 1975. I thought that was very instructive to just remember that that is actually our spiritual strength, just following our teachers. And then adding to Hugo's reflection, I was just thinking how that in itself can be dangerous to assess the gunas all the time in a way that we do not have transcendental vision, and we often not understand how that vision or how the Lord is playing in other people's lives. And in a sense, we can like see devotees running around and being very stressful and forget that actually even that stress, when in connection to the sadhana or in connection to the service, is actually a transcendental anxiety. And that is even on a higher platform than just sitting in a cave and being peaceful. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you.
That can be dangerous.
Those are all wonderful points. And how do you say your name, Prabhu, by the way?
Oh, it's Angelica.
Angelica, okay, got it. Thank you. Yes, so those are all really important points. And like you mentioned, spiritual strength, that's important. And even like taking that stress, and this goes back to Hugo, I think your point, or to your question, but in this world, especially when we're not on the mountaintop, or in the village, or in the cave, obviously there's stress there, but when we're in the world, we're taking on a lot of stress, to your point. And that stress also, though, is part of our service, potentially. And we don't want that to overcome us, but there's also, stress can be healthy because it pushes us forward in our service. Sometimes we have to take some stress to serve. Actually, we see Srila Prabhupada took so much stress to be here, to give us what he gave us, to come across from India, the Jaladuta, etc. We don't necessarily have to do that. We may not be at that position, definitely probably not, but we can do it in our own way and try to serve. And there might be some stress from that. We can view it as a form of our service as well, because there's no endeavor in this world without some stress, some anxiety, and some endeavor, some hard work. So all that is very true. Thank you for that. Also, there's a question in the chat that I wanted to address as well. And on behalf of, if you don't mind, if I can address that. Okay, cool. Karthik had mentioned this wonderful question. He says, how does one engage constructively in goodness with someone who is being intentionally destructive in tamas? Is it better to disengage and walk away? What if something truly important is at stake? I'm thinking of an employee evaluation committees at work where someone's job career is at stake. Okay, so without knowing too much around what the details of what you're sharing, I would say there's a couple things. Sometimes it is important to walk away. This is just some of my thoughts, briefly sharing. Sometimes it is important to walk away if the energy is very destructive, to disengage. I'm not sure how they're exactly being destructive, but that can definitely be a way to deal with it. also, if you feel like you're in a position, often someone who's in tamas, it sounds like they might be belittling, they might be demeaning, they might be criticizing, judgment, some of the things we talked about in that vein when it comes to conversations in the mode of tamas. You might want to think about how you can also help them, and if you have the capacity to help them or ability to engage with it, or someone that you know who has the ability to. If someone is more situated in sattva and they have maturity about them, you can actually help someone who's in a lower mode come up a little bit more. So someone's in tamasi, maybe that person, he or she, is in a lot of pain. Maybe they're not feeling heard on certain things. There's usually something that's going on underneath. If someone is acting in that way, there's usually something going on underneath the surface in their mind and body, that's propelling them to. And then, not to say that that's a good thing for them to do, but it's propelling them to act in that way. And so if you can, also another way to deal with it is to have, again, a conversation with them. If you feel like you're in a more sattvic place, to actually understand, again, creating understanding, creating illumination, creating clarity, and hold space for them. You can even sit them down and have a conversation with them and say, hey, I'm seeing this is coming from you. What's going on here? And people actually really feel that. If you come to it without personal agenda, without judgment, and you're engaging with someone, it might be actually helpful for them to get a couple things off their heart, out of their heart and off their chest and share with you. And that might help them actually start to give up some of those tamasic behaviors if they're criticizing, if they're judging, if they're belittling, etc. So that's one way you can address that. Another way is to definitely disengage with it. There are multiple ways, but those are two that come to my mind off the bat. I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you want some more clarity or if that's helpful. Because there's I'm glad that's helpful, Prabhu. Because there's always something going on when someone's behaving in that way. They're under a lot of stress. Maybe they were spoken to like that. Maybe there's some pain or behind the scenes. Getting that out in the air and addressing that instead of just walking away may be helpful actually in dealing with it. Although sometimes you might have to just walk away too if you have to protect your own energy and your own health as well. Okay, great. Any other questions? Any other comments or thoughts? I think we're well over time. Right, Prabhu? How are we doing?
I think it's hard with your classes, Anuj, Sharma, Prabhu, because we all get so much out of them that it's hard to let you go.
Thank you.
That's why the chat always blows up as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really glad that I could bring just things that I'm learning. And it's really nice because when I am preparing for the class, I'm learning as well with all of you, actually. I try not to come here and want to just share and come from a place of, again, being right. I just try to be very mindful of not doing that, but being mindful of we're all learning in this case. And it's given me a great opportunity to also learn. So thank you. I'm happy to pass that along to all of you and also us to have an engaging discussion on how we can apply these things to our life.
Anuj, Sharma, Prabhu, beautiful coaching session. So we can take one more reflection. Would anyone like to contribute? Okay. All right. I think this is it. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. If you see a devotee stressing out, come up to them, give them a big hug, tell them about Anuj Sharma Prabhu's Facebook page where they can connect with him and put everything in perspective in relationship to Krishna. Okay, thank you very much. And he's on Instagram. Yes, give them a hug. Tell them about Anuj Sharma Prabhu's Instagram page. Invite them to come to class every morning. It's hard to maintain, like it was mentioned so beautifully. So this is the mode of goodness when you show up regularly to the Sangha and glorify Krishna regularly. Ask pertinent questions regularly. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Sunday. Don't go under the modes. Don't let the ice crack. And make sure your wife is watching you in case you go too wild. And then in this sense, wife does a great service in that sense. I get yelled at regularly, and that saves my life many times. So thank you very much to all the wives out there, to you in particular, for saving Anuj Prabhu from being trapped under the ice. Sure, she was on the bank holding that red letter, ready to throw it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Luckily in that example, I was very I just was one step in, so I just jumped right back. But your point is, I think you're speaking from much experience here, probably it sounds like, but it definitely our significant others are very helpful and actually partners in our devotional life. So it's really, really important. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful Sunday, everybody, and see you again next time tomorrow. Good seeing everybody's bright face.